Hello everyone, my name is Joe and today I will guide you through an Oxbridge Linguistics mock interview question. So in an Oxbridge interview there are 4 areas that they tend to be interested in linguistics. Today we are going to focus on number 3, language puzzles. These are the main skill area that you're going to be tested on because there is actually no longer an entrance exam for linguistics. There used to be, I took it back in the day, but now it's all done in the interview under perhaps more stressful circumstances. So it's really important that you're good at working under that pressure and you can really show your skills. So language puzzles, they come in 2 types. They have a Rosetta type and a match-up type. The Rosetta type is effectively a list of sentences in a language. For example, in my interview, I was given Kurdish, and you had to translate them into English. They're very similar sentences, so you can work with the vocabulary, work out what's what, work out the word order. They're not impossible, they are just logic, and you have to translate them into English. It's more about the way you think. I actually didn't finish my puzzle in the interview. I probably got to question 6 maybe out of 10, but it's more about showing the way you think. And match-up exercises are the more fun one, they're the more interesting one because they are vocabulary matching. It's very much rule-based. You're going to see the differences and similarities between languages, and the idea is that you work out why they're similar or different. We're going to start with a match-up today, just because I think they're an easier way to get your brain into the logical way of thinking. So our match-up puzzle today will be Romance languages. As you can see by the background information, the Roman Empire spread Latin all over Europe and has left us with a ton of Romance varieties. Everyone knows the big ones, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, maybe Romanian, but there are hundreds of them really. And this is what makes them quite interesting, because below the surface there's a lot more interesting things that we can investigate and learn more about. So today we are going to be looking at how Vulgar Latin, the spoken variety, changed and became the languages that we're left with today. So as you can see by this very small camera icon in the top right hand corner, I'm going to ask you to take a quick screenshot of this slide so you've got the information for later. It's very important that you keep this one with you, and it's going to be a key part of your analysis. So here is our preliminary information. You're normally given a handful of words to work with, and you need to kind of use that to answer the questions that follow. I always recommend taking a very quick preliminary analysis, maybe 5 minutes or so, 10 if you need, just to posit some rules that relate Vulgar Latin to A, to B, and to C. So that's what we're going to do to start with. So screenshot that table there, and we'll move straight on to what links Vulgar Latin and language A. As again, how you can see by these icons, I'm going to ask you to pause, take a moment, and write down any sound changes that you can see that relate Vulgar Latin to language A. What's changed since Vulgar Latin to give us language A? So I am back again, and I'm hoping that you have gone ahead and thought of some rules. Here is what I thought of. Here's the one I made earlier. I picked up on 4 main rules. Do not worry about the terminology that I've used here. It's effectively just a habit to use something to group things together. You can call it whatever you want, but it's handy if you do know a little bit of terminology. It will help you to group things together. So we can see that the A has become E in certain environments, in words which have M endings. We notice that Katum does not become she in this language. It is retained as an A, so there must be only certain places where the A changes. That's very important to remember. Again, we also see that consonants seem to disappear without a trace. This little kind of 0 icon with a line through, that means nothing in linguistics. So we notice that T goes to nothing in certain words. We also see that a lot of endings in this language have been completely disappearing, basically. So this M becomes nothing, ium becomes nothing, and the also becomes nothing. And I've got a last process that I picked up on, and I wasn't quite sure how to label it myself, and that's the challenge of these kind of exercises. I noticed that this L in certain places becomes an S, and this L in other places becomes a Y, so the J is a Y in this case. The L to Y is very common. The L to S, maybe not so much, so I did raise an eyebrow there, but it's good that we picked up on it. So let's move on to language B. Take a look at this table here and see how Vulgar Latin relates to language B. Pause the slide, grab your pen and paper, and take a moment just to write down maybe 3 or 4 rules you can see about how Vulgar Latin relates to language B, and we'll check in just a moment. As you can see, we have no changes in language B when it comes to vowels. This A change. In language A, we saw that A becomes E, but here the A is retained. So we have matrem, maro. They kind of keep that A, which is quite handy to know. It means that we can see in language B, this old A has been retained. We also see that the consonant T is lost, but again, in a more restricted way in language B. It's only deleted when it's followed by a R sound. We also have a reduction of unstressed syllables in language B. So not all syllables, like in language A, are just completely deleted. Instead, they are just reduced. So we see that this rem ending becomes R, and this yam ending is The air also becomes This is very common in languages over time, so it's nothing that surprises us, but it's valuable that we have a more retained ending, where language A rather got rid of them completely. We see that language B has just weakened them. There's only one ending that's really been lost, and it's that ending at the bottom, which is completely gone. So compare this to what you found, fill in any rules you've missed out, and then we'll go ahead and move on in just a moment. Here we have language C. Again, same thing applies. This time, pause the slide, grab your pen and paper, and write down a handful of rules which relate Vulgar Latin to language C. And back again here with language C. Here are the 4 changes that I found. We can see that this A becomes oi before N. We notice that in mama and tata, I'm not sure if they're actually the same root or if they're put there to distract you. I'm not 100%, but as far as we know from what we can see, we cannot be sure that A becomes oi in all environments, because we are looking at mama and tata where the A has been retained as A and did not become moima and toita. That's not what happened here. So the A changes, but in very restricted environments. We also see that the consonant L disappears between 2 vowels. Ignore this L in fuel. I think that's actually incorrect from the creators. I do know this language myself, and I don't think it's a fair comparison. I think the appropriate word they should have used is fiu, F-I-U, without the L, because the L did actually disappear here. Again, you wouldn't be able to notice that, and they probably wouldn't make that mistake in the interview, so it's not too much of an issue. We also have an interesting change, haplology, which is obviously a very fun word. If you've ever said the word library in fast speech, it's likely that you've said library, and that's haplology, because similar syllables in fast speech do tend to be reduced or deleted. The extra one is just thrown away. So we see here that sororem becomes sora, and it might have something to do with that change in stress. In case you're not familiar, this kind of apostrophe symbol means where the stress is. So what the syllable that immediately follows the apostrophe is the stressed syllable of the word. So we see that the stress changed in language C as well. So sororem became sora, possibly in part due to the change in stress as well, because we know that unstressed syllables tend to be reduced. We can see here that M becomes E, yam becomes A, up more accurately becomes U. So language C seems to retain Vulgar Latin a lot more. It has the least reduction of unstressed syllables out of the 3. There are some things that surprise us here. This mama, tata, pizika, they're a bit strange. They're not quite what we'd expect. So it's worth flagging them and making sure that they don't lead us down a false path. We know that they're not what we expect, especially as fiika as well. These are things that are put there to distract us. Some languages do this, but because languages A and B don't do it, we have to assume that language C went down its own path. But that's pretty much everything for our preliminary analysis. Let's go ahead and pull everything together. So we've brought everything together. Take a screenshot here. We're going to be able to use this later on. This is an important part, bringing everything together. It's very unlikely you'd be able to get this much information in 5 minutes of looking at the data, but it's very handy to have for later, as you'll see. So once you've taken that screenshot, let's move on. So here we have got our first question, which is to fill in the table using the information that we have so far. So feel free to refer back to the screenshots and also your rules that you've thought of in your preliminary analysis to effectively match the vocab to the right language. We've thought a lot about the character of each language, things that for example, is quite eroded, it's quite weakened, it's missing a lot. Things that C, for example, preserves better, like the endings. Use that information to fill in the table and come back when you're finished. So pause, go ahead now, fill in the table and come back when you're done. So here are the answers. As you can see, based on our information, we've been able to fill in these numerical words from Vulgar Latin to languages A, B, and C. The main thing to think of here are these general principles, like these vowels, this dues, the de in language A. We know that kind of OE sound is a language A thing. We also know that these syllables, the schwa syllables, are a language B and C thing. A lot of these principles are really handy to remember when you're filling in the information. So let's go ahead and move on to the next question. So here we are with another table filling question, question 2. Using the information that you've got so far, go ahead and fill in the Romance words into the correct columns for Vulgar Latin A, B, and C, and then also pop in the English translations as well. Go ahead, pause the video, copy down the table and complete that question. We'll check back in a second. So here we are with the answers. You can see that language A hasn't surprised us at all. The shortest stems do tend to belong to language A. We can make use of the information that we've gathered so far to say that these words like o, vi, all belong in language A, not just because they're quite short, but also because they're missing a lot of endings. They're not just weakened endings, they are completely gone altogether. We can also see that this lambda symbol, the upside down Y, is very much a language B thing. So you could put these bottom two words into language B. And you could also see that the language C seems to preserve the vowels a lot more, so it has these longer fluare viazza kind of words. They obviously are a better fit there than language A, so it's very much a logical thing using process of elimination to find the right answer. We've also got those English translations of water, sing, flower, and so on. That relies on your general intelligence of like linking this Latin aqua to water, florem to flower, and so on and so forth. That one's more of a general question. You wouldn't really find that so much in the interview. It's more about the vocabulary matching. So let's go ahead and move on. It's also worth writing down while you were working out the kind of match-up exercise just then, there are maybe 5 or 6 new rules that you've learned that are worth adding to your kind of list. So go ahead, take a screenshot before we do move on, just to add these rules. So you can see that in language B, this qu in Vulgar Latin becomes more of a w or something along those lines. In languages A and B, this kind of ST cluster changes. It becomes ust or e. In language A in particular, the S is lost completely. In language B, the kind of ere ending in Latin became ura. And then in language B, the V becomes a B. And in language C, the vowels were lengthened and became diphthongs. So the O becomes oa and I, ya. Again, as you're working through the questions, write down anything that you find out, because it's almost certain that you will find out more as you go along, and it helps you in the next question. So you might as well write it down now and then move on. So let's go ahead and move on to the next question. So here we are with question 3. This is quite a challenging one. Based on everything that you know so far, you are going to have to write in the missing pronunciations or meanings in English, including any of the rules which might have helped you. I'm not going to lie, I found this challenging as well. This is normally the most challenging part. You have no kind of match-up vocabulary list to stand on here, and it all relies on you and what you've noted down so far. It is, however, entirely possible with everything that we've discussed so far to complete this exercise. So go ahead, pause the video, take a moment, copy down the table and fill it out. Give it your best shot, and we'll check in a moment with what I came up with and we'll compare. So here is what I came up with. As you can see, there are a lot of facts you can rely on. Equally, there are a lot of ways you can go about this. This list here is not exhaustive. It's not the only way you go about it. I'm sure there's a whole load of different ways you can find these answers and get the exact same reconstruction. So don't be discouraged if you found a completely different way. Or if you found something that's slightly different, just go through the facts that you've got so far, see if you've missed a rule. Alternatively, you could have found a completely different route. So let me run through what I've gone for, basically. For this panem to start with, I knew that language B loses these nem endings, so it was perfectly reasonable to go for a pa. And I knew that a does not become e in language B. With language C, I knew that a does become ui, especially before n. So poine was a good answer because I knew that these nem endings in language C don't disappear altogether like they do in language B. They just lose the m, so it's poine. This ne ending survives. What I will say is for the next row, this stella, that's tough. It's tougher to go back in time than forward because until now, we've been saying what things become as they go forward in time. So how did I get to stellam? We know that there were changes to the st, the st clusters, but we know that language C tends to be quite faithful. So we know that language C tends to retain these stems. So I knew that stel was a good starting point. As for the ending, I knew that this language B would be the hint here. This lambda and schwa normally signals an am ending. If you go back to our very first set of information, you could see that the am endings translate to a schwa and the lambda in language B. When it came to beja, this how vekla changed in the third row, I knew that it was old feminine because we saw old masculine already in the previous table, and I knew that V becomes B in language B. And we also have this schwa and lambda combination. We know that the schwa, at least in adjectives, it tends to translate to a KL, a KL cluster, and this a ending becomes and we know that these m endings are normally for nouns. I didn't write that here, but it's something to keep in mind. Word categories tend to be important when you're making these decisions. So we go then to oculum, which was also a challenge. I knew that the in language A, this rather, this definitely meant that we started with o, as o becomes in language A. And we know that language C keeps our Ks, so it was ok. As we can see in language C, it keeps that stem. This lambda in B, and it's a noun, suggests a lum ending. And notice that it's lambda on its own, not lambda with a schwa. It's lambda on its own, which is a lum ending. Lambda with a schwa, on the other hand, suggests more of a lam ending in nouns. This videt to vede, I thought that it was best if we think about it in terms of these two rows here. Now note that you can always, if the information is not from the previous kind of section, if it's not available in the previous section, it might be in front of you. So here we can see that the videre in the row underneath becomes veda in language C. So we know this e became e at some point. So therefore the videt become vede. We know that the t at the end is normally deleted in language C. So we've got a combination, the stem change, vid to ved, and we know that language C loses the T. And then again, underneath, we know that V becomes B in language B, so videre to beure, V becomes B, and we also know that the ere ending becomes ura from I believe our second table exercise. So we know that also means see based on the row above. And the last one was the most challenging, this cuando. This was a real tough one. I know that language B keeps this quan stem, and it's highly likely that this entire stem, quan, because a nasalized vowel, which is that little wiggly line on top of the a in language A, ka, a, it's highly likely that we had an N after it. So this quan stem is pretty solid because the k is kept in language B and C, and the n is kept in language B. And then we can also say there was very, very likely a D in Vulgar Latin because language C has kind. Kund, sorry, I think that's an I with a line through it, so kund. So the only thing that's left is why can't we have quand? When I had quand, I realized that in Latin, so far in this evidence that we have, there is not a single word that has an nd ending. So therefore we needed to find a vowel because we can't just assume that Latin will allow quand as a word if there's no evidence for that ending. The only option I had was that language C does delete an o after a dental sound, so it deletes it after a t or a d, as we saw with octo, opt. So therefore we can safely assume that Vulgar Latin likely had an o on the end, quando. So that was quite a lengthy one, but we got there in the end. And it just shows you can rely on these rules to get you through. So we'll go ahead and move on to our next question in a moment. Just take a moment to make sure that you've really taken this in and make sure that you've got everything right so far. So, as is very important in an Oxbridge interview, you need to be able to explain yourself. This final question is where I'm going to ask you to go ahead and refer back to the information we've got so far, everything we've learned, and put it together in a very, very coherent way. Go ahead and write out a hypothesis for language A and language B. I've taken care of language C as an example because I think language C is a bit of a mess, but go ahead and take care of language A and language B. You can see in the example below, I effectively offered rules that I think are as accurate as they can be, but also as brief as they can be. So they're very clear and concise. And I've also accounted for exceptions as well. I've said that there are anomalies compared to the other languages. It's important to try and think of reasons why. I'll leave you to go ahead and think of why that might be. But it's important to account for everything and all and only everything, if that makes sense. So I'll leave you to go ahead, pause the video and take care of that final question now, and we'll check back in a moment. Perfect. So I hope that you kind of were able to really get your linguistic brain going with the last question. I will leave you with that. You can refer to the example of language C. For now, though, I'll finish up with some food for thought. It's worth thinking about, first of all, why language C might have lots of apparent exceptions. Think about the nature of language, everything that you've learned over the course of your studies about language, or in your own reading about language and how it changes. Think about reasons why language C might have these kind of exceptions to the rules. And then think about, what do you know about sound changes in languages and how do they happen? Are they regular? Do they have exceptions? Why do they have exceptions? What's the point of that for linguistics? Does that mean that our theories aren't valid? And then finally, considering languages A, B, and C, they've lost a lot of Latin's endings. Is it fair to say they're any less complex? Could we even go as far as saying that not all languages are as complex as each other, What's your viewpoint on the matter? That's actually a real question that I got asked in my interview, so it's worth having a think about these ideas about language attitudes. And I've also left some suggested reading just underneath. Historical Linguistics by Lyle Campbell. If you've been really interested in what we've talked about so far, it's worth a read. It's a massive part of the first year linguistics curriculum. So I would 100% recommend giving it a quick flick through, maybe even mentioning it in your personal statement. And overall, I wish you the best of luck in your applications.